Hi, and welcome to the Power Hungry Podcast. I'm Robert Bryce. On this podcast, we talk about energy, power, innovation, and politics. And my guest today, I'm happy to introduce, is Brad Rockwell, the Executive Manager of Operations at the Kauai Island Utility Cooperative. Brad, thanks for being with me today and with us today.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Robert. Happy to be here.
So we're going to talk about the Kauai Island Utility Cooperative and how it's unique, and that it runs primarily or a lot of the time on 100% renewables. But Brad, I could introduce you, but I prefer to let my guests introduce themselves. So if you don't mind, give us a quick introduction, as though you just arrived at a party and don't know anyone there. Give us the 60, 90-second intro, if you don't mind.
Yeah, I think the short version is just I'm a conventional energy, conventional power guy that studied this stuff in college and practiced it a little bit in the Navy on active duty and in private industry with some companies like GE and the like, and somehow found myself in the middle of the Pacific in a place where renewables made a lot of sense for financial reasons because our other options were pretty limited. So an unlikely person to be in the middle of or I should say on the tip of the spear, I guess, of the renewable high penetration renewables, and especially with solar. Solar has really been where we've done a lot over here, and it's been exciting. It probably would have been boring if I just come over and run conventional low power plants. So it's been fun, but I definitely see the value of both, and I'm sort of an everything on the table kind of strategy guy when it comes to energy. I think there's trade-offs with anything, and you need to have all options available.
Sure. Well, let's jump right in and talk about that because, like a lot of people in the power sector, especially on the engineering side, you're a former Navy guy, which I didn't quite understand until I realized, every ship has its own electrical system. So they need electricians and people who know how to manage them. But the Kauai Island story, I think, is the Kauai Island Utility Cooperative story is really an interesting one for a lot of reasons. Among them, that it's a relatively new co-op. But I want to cut to the reason why we're talking, and that is that you're able to utilize a higher penetration of renewables than any other electric grid that I know of. So, on average, tell me what is that penetration, and what's the mix of renewables that you're using?
Yeah, and I don't know that we're higher than anywhere. I know, just to caveat that, I know places like Iceland, I think, are doing it with a lot of geothermal and large hydro, and but that said, every place is different, and for us, we're operating almost every day for multiple hours at a time at 100% renewable. And when we're doing that, we have a little bit of hydro, a little bit of biomass, but about 80 to 85% is coming from solar, with some of that back firmed up by storage. On an annual basis, we're running about 65%. And that's increasing. We're about to bring on another month or so, we'll bring on another large solar and storage project, which could push us up over 70% on an annual basis.
So you can regular solar PV, it would connected to storage, and what's the chemistry on the batteries? What kind of batteries are you using, and how big is the storage system?
They're all lithium ion, and so we have really two large solar and storage plants. One is a 13 megawatt Tesla project, and it's got a 4 hours of storage at the full 13 megawatts, so 52 megawatt hours. It's actually rated for about 60. And then we have an AES project that's a 20 megawatt AC solar PV, and it's got, again, the full capability on the power side of storage. So it's 20 megawatt battery for 5 hours, so it's a 100 megawatt hour battery. And then this next project we're bringing on in a month is a 14 megawatt solar project, AC. These are all AC ratings, and 14 megawatt battery with 5 hours again. So that's a 70 megawatt hour battery. So when you add it all up, we're 230 megawatt hours of storage for an island that averages 50 megawatts of demand 24/7. We peak at about 80 megawatts in the evening, and we get down to about 35 in the wee hours of the morning.
But 50 is an average, 70 in the 70s is the high, and then half that is the low, roughly.
Right.
And I've heard you present before at a cooperative meeting. I'm not sure where it was exactly that we met, but I was intrigued because it's really the mix. You were largely dependent on diesel fired generators for years, right? When the
Yeah.
cooperative first was formed, and that's the other thing that's interesting about the cooperative is that it's pretty new. It's less than 20 years old. Is that right?
That's true. 2002 we started. Yeah. So we had, the history of electricity in Hawaii and on Kauai specifically is all ties back to the sugar plantations. That's where it all came from. And they traditionally had small hydro plants up in the mountains delivering water to the sugarcane fields. And then they were using the bagasse to generate power through a steam turbine. So we used to be virtually all renewable. And then they started mixing in some diesel generators, in the 50s and 60s and 70s. And then sugar plantations sort of couldn't compete on the world market, and they all started closing down in the 80s and 90s. And so how are you going to replace that power? Well, oil was cheap then, put in diesel generators. We don't have the luxury of having natural gas or, large hydro dams type of thing. And actually, coal and nuclear fission power plants are specifically prohibited in the Hawaii state constitution. So, there you have it. Most of where the continent gets its power from is we don't really have those choices here.
I didn't realize that coal is specifically prohibited for power
any
generation.
new coal plants. There is one coal plant on Oahu, but its PPA runs out at the end of 2022, and they are not going to allow it to extend. So that has to be replaced.
Sure. Well, and I know that Hawaii as a whole has a 100% renewable mandate by 2050, right? So
2045.
2045. And so Kauai Island may be the first one that hits that target. And what's interesting too is you're doing it all without any wind energy. Is that right?
That's true. Yeah, wind has been challenged here on Kauai for sort of what I call the trifecta. We have threatened and endangered seabirds that the other islands don't have. They've already been the populations have been decimated already there. We don't have, relatively speaking, as good a wind regimes as some of the other islands in Hawaii because our mountains are not as tall, to put it simply. And we don't really have any willing landowners that want the wind turbines over here. So we haven't really pushed for it. And frankly, solar seems to be much more acceptable by the community, and the price point is better for us at the scale we can do. So our grid is relatively smaller than the other islands. We're about a third of what Big Island and Maui peaks at, and we're about a 12th to a 15th of Oahu, where most of the people live.
Sure. And so tell me how many meters. I know that in the cooperative world, well, in investor-owned utilities, everybody wants to know, well, how big is the utility? How many meters do you have? And then what is the average consumption? Because this is the other part, I think, that makes your cooperative and your operation unique is that there are many things, right? You're an island first, but also your electricity consumption per meter is still relatively low. Run me through those numbers if you don't mind.
It is. Yeah, we're about 34,000 meters. And our average residential use monthly is about 500 kilowatt hours per month, which is, probably close to half of what people on the mainland use. And that's because of the stable climate here. Nobody has heat in their homes, and very few people even have air conditioning. So, the climate's very stable. It's never too hot, never cold. And people spend a lot of time outside, because the weather's good year round, and we don't have any large industry. So yeah, it's very manageable.
500 kilowatt hours per meter, and that's not per capita, which here, on average in the United States, per capita consumption is 11,000, 12,000 kilowatt hours per person. Now you figure, what is it, 2.2 or 2.3 people per household?
Yep. exactly.
per capita consumption is going to be even lower than that number. So
True.
so you have relatively modest load. And then the other part that I think is interesting is that, and solar and storage are clearly gaining traction. There's no doubt on, all over the world. But you're using biomass, a biomass fired plant. So run me through the different generators that you have, because you have a whole
Sure.
fleet of different generators using different fuels, and you're using at different times. Can you run me through those that outline those facilities for me?
Sure, sure. We have our Port Allen power plant is sort of our historical, started in the early 1960s, and it's got about 13 different units there. So there's 9 diesel generators of different sizes, some 5 locomotive type diesels. We've got 4 Wärtsilä type, diesels, marine diesels. We've got 2 GE frame gas turbines. So those are like the heavy industrial gas turbines, but older technology, nothing too new, and they're smaller. They're about 20 megawatts each. And then we have a steam turbine also at that Port Allen plant that just has an oil-fired boiler, but it can also take waste heat from the gas turbines. Our other fossil plant is our Copaya power station. That's our newest unit. That was the reason I came to Kauai, was to help get that going, and it came online in 2002, right as the co-op was forming. And that burns either diesel or naphtha, but it's an aeroderivative gas turbine. And we've actually
an aeroderivative, meaning it's similar to what you find on a jet engine. Is that
exactly? Yeah. So
yep.
I mean, the point there is very thin casings. It's a light unit. When you do an overhaul on that thing, you actually fly it to the shop, whereas the frame type gas turbines have these very thick cast iron casings, and you can't ever ship that off. You do that work on site.
I see.
And then and we've added a synchronous condensing capability to that aeroderivative gas turbine, which is very critical to our ability to operate at 100% renewables. We can get into later, but those are 2 conventional.
Well, if you don't mind, because I'd like to stay there for just a second, because
Okay.
I think that's an interesting part of the ability of grids to use high penetration renewables is to require synchronous generation. Tell me why that matters. What does the synchronous generation capability do?
Yeah, the critical, so if you break it all down, high penetration renewables in a place like Iceland, for example, and I'm not trying to, shortchange them or anything, but, when you're doing it with hydro and geothermal, you still got synchronous machines that are essentially, it's just a cleaner fuel, if you will. And so what synchronous machines do is they provide rotating mass, they provide inertia to the grid. They provide amazing fault correct potential. So when there's a fault on the grid, the transient, line comes down is the simplest example. Voltage sags, and you need something to provide overcurrent, which will trip relay protected devices and clear that fault so that line is not hot when it falls to the ground. And so these rotating machines have an amazing capability to provide that overcurrent that inverter-based generation does not. Same with inertia. And then there's also the voltage support. Those are kind of the 3 main things. But there's also sort of another thing that I'm realizing, and try not to get too technical, but the way you measure frequency, typically rotating machines, they're measuring frequency by the speed of the shaft. They've got a tachometer and a gear tooth, and it's quite simple. When that thing slows down because of a fault, you can see it right there on this high-speed tachometer and the controls. Well, an inverter doesn't have anything rotating, and so inverters are trying to measure grid frequency based on the sine wave of that AC signal. And during
60 cycles per second, going back and forth,
right,
and back and forth. Right. Yeah.
Exactly. And when a fault condition occurs, that sine wave can be somewhat distorted, and so the inverter may not have an accurate understanding of what frequency is, and now you're asking that inverter to respond to a change in frequency. It can be somewhat difficult.
So if
So,
I can interrupt it, the way I think of it, and if I've got it wrong, correct me. But the grid inertia is critical because it's similar to water pressure. I think that's the way I think about it, right? That you need the stability of the grid depends on that ability of the machines that are driving it to have a certain amount of pressure behind the electricity. And I know it's an imperfect analogy, but is that fair?
I think the better analogy is water pressure is more akin to voltage,
Okay.
and inertia is more like, your inertia, the definition of inertia is probably like the resistance to change. So you're going along, it's steady state, everything's fine. A fault occurs. How quickly is frequency going to deviate from 60 hertz now when this fault occurs? If you have a light inertia system like we have on a small islanded grid, frequency is going to want to change very quickly. And pretty soon you could find yourself getting into unstable conditions or having to under frequency load shed to protect the system. On the mainland, clearly when a line comes down somewhere on the bulk electrical system on the continent, it doesn't cause frequency to move very much. That's a huge system with lots of inertia. Over here, it will cause frequency to move, somewhat quickly. So that's the best way to describe it. It's that resistance to change. You want to keep steady state, like a ship moving through the ocean. You've got this mass, this inertia. But the voltage of the system is critical. That's kind of like the pressure in your water hose.
Okay.
If you don't have the pressure, you can't deliver the flow. If you don't have the voltage, you can't deliver the current to the customer.
And the synchronous condensers that you mentioned, or synchronous generators, I want to make sure I got them.
Well, we talked about both. So synchronous
Right.
generators are just all the rotating machines. When you actually, a synchronous condenser is, you don't necessarily have a prime mover behind the generator anymore. You can, but you're not delivering real power with a synchronous condenser. You're delivering reactive power, and that gets
Okay.
into the VAR discussion.
Right. Okay. But the point, and then we've taken a tangent here, a little bit of a left technical left turn, but I think it's important for what I am increasingly understanding is that the one of the renewables have many attributes, but one of the things that is one of their downsides is that issue of making sure that you have enough inertia on the system, that the system
Yes.
can maintain that steady state throughout any kind of change in demand.
Yes.
So anyway, I interrupted you after you were going through the different
Sure.
all the different generation systems that you have. So we've covered pretty much, I think, the fossil side of it,
Right.
and then you have hydro and solar, right?
Yep. Yep. We have the biomass, which you mentioned. So the biomass is interesting. I'll just talk about that briefly. That was really our first new renewable. This was this PPA was signed back in 2009, well before solar PV was at a good price point, even for us here in Hawaii. And so we were struggling to how to transition away from being so dependent on oil as the mid 2000s. The early part of the century saw oil spikes up well over $100 a barrel. We knew we had to transition. So that's how the biomass plant came to be. But it's a small scale plant. It's only 7 megawatts. It's very expensive to do biomass at that scale. But it is interesting because it's a closed loop biomass. They're growing a sustainable forestry plantation and harvesting a part of it. And another neat feature about it is they actually spent the first few years while the plantation was getting established, clearing the island of this very invasive, aggressive tree species called albizia.
Mm-hmm.
So that's been nice. We're seeing, large stands of these albizia getting taken away and chipped up to generate power. So that's the biomass. Our hydro plants are essentially legacy.
And just to be clear, if I can, on the biomass, so you're not using albizia to fuel the biomass. You're growing a different kind of tree. What kind of tree is it?
It's a version of eucalyptus.
I see. Okay.
And it's in a managed plantation, so it won't spread around. Yeah.
I see. Okay. Because this is one of the few, biomass has been very controversial in Europe. And in fact, hauling American wood chips to Europe to burn in their power plants is one of the examples of, many the critics, and I think they're right, is that, well, this makes no sense. You've got a very high carbon footprint moving just those wood chips around, but because it qualifies as renewable, in Europe, that's the route that they're taking. But
Sure.
even though it's only 7 megawatts, to me, that's one of the other interesting things about your system is that this is one of your building blocks that you are depending on, and it sounds like it's working pretty well.
Yeah, no, it is working well. And so, like I said, it's it's a higher cost, but it's a relatively small part of our mix. It's about 10, 11%. So, and it's a synchronous machine. It's a steam turbine. So that's got some value. But there's a biomass plant on the Big Island that people are fighting, which we can get into later as well when we talk about other things like that and how people fight renewables in different
Sure.
places. So the hydro plants are all small hydro. The largest single unit is 6 megawatts, but most of them are actually half a megawatt or a megawatt. Those are, legacy sugar plantation or, 100-year-old hydro turbines. That, in fact, the first power on the island was this hydro power plant that's still in operation. It started in 1905 and provided power. They built a transmission line across the island. So from the north shore of the island to this hydro plant, transmission line across the island to power these huge irrigation pumps to provide water to the sugar fields. So we get we're about 15% on an annual basis from hydro. And that tends to complement the solar somewhat well. When it's rainy, it's not sunny, and vice versa. And then the rest.
And those hydro, just to be clear, and so are these, what do they call them, run of stream or run of river hydro?
Run of river, exactly.
So they're not impoundments. There's no dam there that,
no.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, just small little diversions that take some water from the streams and then put it back in the stream down later on.
I see.
Yeah. And then solar we have, too many to really run through, but I'll just kind of break it into thirds. So about a third, we have over 100 megawatts nameplate solar installed on our system. Like I told you, midday we're about 50 to 60 megawatts of demand. So how do we do that? We have more solar capacity than we have demand. Well, a third of that is rooftop solar from customers. So roughly 33 megawatts of rooftop solar. And when you look around at the roofs, people install this stuff in all different forms and fashions. Sometimes it's on a north-facing roof, or it's overgrown with things, and people aren't managing it so well. So we're not getting the full output of those. But our customers have that choice to put solar on the roof, and I'm happy to get into that if you want later. But another third of that solar capacity, about 32 megawatts, is central station, large, utility scale solar projects without storage. So those are the ones that really move frequency around. In Hawaii, our solar resource is not like the desert southwest of the continent. It's typically partly cloudy over here. So we always have passing clouds, and solar production is moving around all day long. And so we have to deal with that variability. And then the last third is the ones that have enough storage to essentially store all that solar production during the day and then shift it to nighttime, or to firm it up. And those are the ones, those solar and storage with the synchronous condenser are what enabled us to run the grid at 100%, during the day. And like I said, we've gone for as long as 9 hours in any one day, but almost every day we're doing at least a few hours of 100% renewable.
And so what does that mean in terms of cost for your customers? What is your average kilowatt hour price? And do you have time of day pricing?
We don't. We have just one rate, 24/7. We've done some pilots with time of use, but we haven't really seen the value of it yet. But our rate this month is, I believe it's 33 cents a kilowatt hour.
Uh-huh.
And so it used to fluctuate wildly. To give you an example, in the 2008 oil spike, it went to 49 cents a kilowatt hour, and 6 months later, it was down to 22 cents.
Wow.
And so, how do businesses and residents plan for that type of energy bill? It's very hard. So the success of all this renewable penetration, going from 8% renewable in 2010 to over 60% today, has been that all these renewables are fixed price. Fixed price for the whole term. So our our range of our electric prices now are very tight. So yeah, they're still higher than most people would like. I think anyone living anywhere on this earth will tell you they're paying too much for power, but it's very stable now and people can actually plan.
And that 33 cents per kilowatt hour, just to put that in perspective, the average residential rate in the U.S. is about 12 cents.
Sure.
It's been climbing slowly, but that's so. One of the reasons, I put it in the form of a question. One of the reasons that solar and storage work where on for the Kauai Island Utility Cooperative is that your alternative is diesel fuel, and so you have a high price. Your price benchmark is pretty high,
True.
so that the the system that you're operating wouldn't necessarily work somewhere else because of the higher cost of those systems. Is that accurate?
Yeah. I mean, we are clearly, want to do good and to create, use clean energy sources. But we'd be lying if we didn't say there's a financial component. I mean, we wouldn't be doing this if it was going to cost our members, our ratepayers, a lot more money. The nice thing about our renewable push here in Hawaii has been this has actually saved our members money by adding all these renewables, as compared to what oil costs are. But yeah, we're using a transportation fuel, diesel, in units that are not as efficient as because of economy of scale and their small size. We can't do 1,000 megawatt combined cycle H class, 60% efficient gas turbine over here. It's not going to happen. So we have relatively less efficiency because of that, and so it translates to high power cost.
And you say that big unit because in general, as I understand it, and correct me if I'm wrong, in general, historically in the power business, the bigger your power plant, the more efficient it is. That there was just an inherent benefit to having a larger system that you get the benefit of that size. But is that still true today? Because as I look around and look at recent developments in Mexico and California, it seems like the average size generation unit has gotten smaller, substantially so, right? That we're not building necessarily 1,000 megawatt generators very much anymore. Instead, it's 40, 50, 100 megawatts, 200 megawatts. How do you see that, Brad?
Yeah, I mean, the efficiency is still better with the larger units, no doubt. I mean, and when you look at the cost to build a power plant, you've got interconnection, you've got the construction, you've got the civil work, you got, all the equipment and things like that. And so clearly if you can, and a lot of those costs are the same, whether it's 1,000 megawatt plant or a 500 megawatt plant, right? So clearly you're going to get more efficiency if you go larger. But I think probably what you'll find is that there's this push to be more distributed. So that's where the smaller sizes have a place. And the best interconnection sites, you always have to look at how you're going to tie into the grid. You can't just site a power plant anywhere. So some of those interconnection requirements may restrict going to a larger size. So you may only be able to incorporate, 100 megawatt turbine or something like that.
Because you don't have because you don't have the transmission capacity.
Correct. And the cost to, build that is cost prohibitive or something.
Sure.
So, but I think, clearly if you could just, do a number of large plants, it's going to be more efficient. But again, then, maybe those larger plants have to be out in the middle of nowhere, and to transmit the power, you've got more losses. So you can do smaller ones closer to the load center. So, the efficiency I was talking about is at the plant level, not necessarily delivered to the customer, which has to be taken into account.
Right. So you may have a higher capital and operating cost for a smaller generation unit, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's more expensive because of the other issues that involving transmission and the other factors. Is that okay? So,
sure.
So then let's zoom out. I want to zoom out and talk then because we've gone over. Your cooperative is. I'm just looking at the numbers here of 139 employees. As you said, 37,000 meters, 3,000 commercial members. So you're operating your own grid. You're essentially your own regional transmission operator. You have this very unique system that is constrained, and you're able to run it on high penetration renewables. But then I want to first look at Hawaii and the challenges there, and whether you think they can get to 100% renewables by 2045, and then zoom out to the US and some of the issues that we talked about offline about land use conflicts, because that's the other part where you said even on your island you didn't have landowners that were willing to put up with wind turbines or install wind turbines. What's happening in the other islands? I know that there's been a lot of controversy, and I've written about it on the island of Oahu near Kahuku with the wind projects there. And there's also been controversy over the wind projects in Hawaii because of concerns about, and in fact, the mortality problem with birds and bats. So how do you see here's the question. What is Hawaii going to have to do to meet that renewable mandate by 2045, and can they do it?
Yeah, I think the short answer is yes, we can do it. Every island and every place, every grid has a different set of circumstances. So here on Kauai, I feel very confident we can do it. We are more rural, so we have a lot of unused open land to develop more and more solar and storage projects. So we can, we're talking one or two more large solar and storage projects. We're now in the 90%. And the key is we can't give up any of those conventional units, because, we're going to have so many eggs in the solar basket. When we have cloudy days, we're going to need a lot more storage than battery technology can currently do. So we're working on a pumped hydro storage project combined with solar to get us a little bit longer duration, 12-hour type storage instead of 4 or 5. But ultimately, to get that last 5 or 10%, we probably use biodiesel, right? So it's a higher cost fuel, even than our diesel we're running now. But if it's only 5 to 10% of your mix, it doesn't impact the rate a whole lot, and it allows you the confidence to say, okay, when I get a week of clouds, I can run this biofuel, biodiesel in my conventional units. All my units can run biodiesel essentially. So that's the easy button. And
if I can interrupt there, because I think that's an important point, which Wärtsilä has recently put forward. You mentioned Wärtsilä before, the Danish company. I talked to one of their people fairly recently, and they put forward a plan for renewables in California, but it retains the combustion engine. That combustion, there's a big push to get rid of combustion in transportation and so on. But what I'm hearing over and over, and I just heard you say it, is that actually, if batteries will work for a few hours, but if you have more than a few hours, then you're going to need combustion, because it can provide that security of supply better than batteries. Is that a fair way to put it?
I wouldn't say combustion is the key. It's the storage essentially. So whether you're talking battery storage or whether you're talking a tank of fuel that can last you for days.
Yeah, I see.
That's the key, right? I don't care what that fuel is. Maybe battery technology gets there. Maybe we could do a larger pumped hydro, but if I got a fuel tank that lasts me a week, that's a heck of a lot better than a battery that lasts 4 or 5 hours.
Right. I see. Yeah. And the density of that fuel in the tank, that diesel is far greater.
I mean, liquid fuel energy density is just unbelievably, that's just energy. The amount of BTUs per volume in liquid fuels it just can't be matched by anything right now.
Right. Yeah, and that's why one of the reasons why it's so dominant in transportation is that it's nearly miraculous, right? The energy density of diesel fuel and gasoline is it's what is it, 13,000 BTUs per kilogram, something like that. I'm trying to remember. Is it anyway?
I know it in BTUs per gallon because that's what you use, but it's it's about anywhere between 125 and 135,000 BTUs per gallon. Whereas even hydrogen is less than that on a volumetric basis, a lot more on a mass basis. But, if you're going to try and switch to hydrogen, you got to compress it to get it down to fit in a tight space still.
Well, so let's stop there for a second, because hydrogen now is all the rage. And in fact, I was talking to a friend of mine in Washington who's in the natural gas business, and I was asking him about his views on hydrogen. What are your views? You've worked in this business for a long time, and how grids work and how systems work. Is the hydrogen economy coming, and to what extent is it? How much do you believe in it?
Yeah, I mean, I stay, I keep my ears open for it, but it still seems like it's a little further away. I kind of see it could essentially be an option for our biodiesel, right? So we to get to 100% renewable, I talked about how we're going to need some biodiesel. Um, but ultimately, we can run some of our combustion turbines on hydrogen. I mean, there's some work going on now with 30% hydrogen, and they're trying to get that up to 100% hydrogen running in combustion turbines. And so that may be the next step beyond if the price point comes in and the technology gets there. But I don't see that as anywhere in the foreseeable future for us. Over here, we're going to have, because we don't have natural gas to reform and make hydrogen. So it's going to have to be electrolysis, maybe with otherwise curtailed solar energy. And I just, we're on one hand, I feel really blessed living in a place like this where we are the ISO, we're the RTO, we're the utility, we're the IPPs, we develop and own renewables, and we've got conventional. I get to see everything all at once. It's an amazing laboratory to do this stuff. But at the same time, I kind of always say we're too small for science projects. I can't waste my time on hydrogen electrolysis. Until there's someone like a Siemens or a GE or, somebody that's going to back this thing and it's proven, then, okay, we can bring it over here. But we don't really do pilot projects and science projects. I don't have the personnel to deal with that stuff.
Sure.
We have to focus on doing things that are real and here and now.
Yeah. Well, and is it fair to say, as you said that, it just popped in my head, well, we're not going to do science projects, and partly that's due to just your size, right? That you're not, your consumption rates are far lower than the average consumer in the continental U.S. So it's another part of the uniqueness of your system, your system compared to, and I've been to Iceland, and you don't have geothermal there, right? You have some hydro, but geothermal is 25% of their mix. So anyway, so you said that you thought that back to the state of Hawaii, you think that the state could get there. But if I'm looking at what happened in Kahuku, to what extent is that all renewable mix going to be split between solar and wind? Do you think it's going to be more solar? How do you look at the ball for me?
So, I hadn't really gotten to the rest of the state. I was talking about here on Kauai, we can get there now. I think Maui and the Big Island are similar to Kauai in that they're still very rural, and there are, lots of open space. They have more demand, so it's a little more challenging. But especially on Hawaii, on the Big Island, they have geothermal. It's the only island that has geothermal. I mean, that island's still growing from lava flows. They've done wind. Clearly they can do a lot of solar. They have hydro there, so they've got sort of a wealth of renewable resources over there. I think that's very possible, and they've always been a leader in renewables. Maui too, I think. But when you get to Oahu, that's the real problem. I mean, you've got an island that's almost the same size as us here, but it's got close to 1 million people in it, and so it's more urban, a lot of the island. So you don't have the open spaces. As we talked about energy density. Renewables are really weak in that area. They require a lot of land, and as we're finding out over the last couple of years, people don't necessarily want these renewables right in their neighborhood. Especially the wind turbines. And there was a fight last year where AES was putting in some wind turbines on the north shore of Oahu at Kahuku. I guess apparently up close to a neighborhood, and folks there were saying, well, why do we have to look at these things? These are 568-foot tall wind turbines. In a place like Hawaii, we'd rather look at the beautiful mountains. And what are we getting for this?
Sure.
Well, why do we have to look at it? So there's a push. Well, that plant ended up, I think it's completed construction. It may be generating power now. It ultimately went through, but there's still some pending litigation and things. So
as I recall, the neighbors are still fighting it, and there were 200 people arrested in the protests, and that was in November of 2019. So it was remarkable to see, and I saw the photos in the Honolulu Star Advertiser. I've never seen civil disobedience to that scale involving renewables. And to me, it was just another example of these issues of land use conflicts. So and you mentioned that yourself. So the Hawaii, Maui, but you think that the Oahu then of the islands will have the most difficult time meeting that renewable mandate. Is it
Sure.
possible that other islands would then cable over some of the power to Oahu, or is that even?
Ooh,
I don't
I
know
don't think
I
so.
don't know my geography in Hawaii,
Well, no,
how far those distances are.
I mean, it's a great idea, and actually, it was an idea that was floated around a few years ago, and there was some work done on it. And at first glance, you think, yeah, it makes sense, right? Oahu. I mean, clearly, us on what we call the neighbor islands can't exist with the quality of life we have without the hub of Honolulu Airport, the port. That's where everything that comes to Kauai comes essentially through Honolulu, via large ships, gets put on smaller barges and comes here. So we benefit from Honolulu having all that infrastructure. So you could make a case to say, well, why shouldn't, if Kauai has extra open land, even after we've gone to 100% renewable, why shouldn't we build out more renewables and send that excess power to Honolulu? And clearly it'd be good for us as a company to be able to sell them power. But there's a real resistance for folks that live in a rural area to overbuild renewables that are already sensitive to power the big city. And I think you'll see that anywhere. I mean, I think if you look at any sort of undersea cable, it's always been the opposite, where you're going from a large population or a place that has a lot of energy infrastructure already, sending it to a small island, or that doesn't make sense to build a power plant there, not the opposite.
Well, I think that's a key point, because I see that happening over and over. In fact, all across the U.S., you had San Bernardino County, California, the largest county by area in America last year, said no more large-scale renewable projects. This county is the home of Ivanpah and Abengoa Mojave. You can't build thermal solar there. You can't build wind, and generally you can't build much new wind capacity in California at all. And you see the same kinds of conflicts in New York for onshore wind. So I think it is exactly as you said. I think it's very much the urban rural divide, and I don't see any cure for that. I think it's very much about people concerned about their own neighborhoods.
Yeah, no, I get it. Nobody wants a power plant next to them. I understand that, and I think solar is probably the most palatable because it doesn't mess up your view plane. It doesn't make noise. It's no moving parts.
Right.
Species impacts are limited. So if people are against even solar, then wow, I think, look forward to more nuclear plants, which, hopefully, because, why not build more nuclear then? In that case, it's the one that doesn't emit any greenhouse gases. And as I heard on your podcast the other day, I thought it was a great point. It's all the waste is contained, where it is. So you're not emitting stuff into the atmosphere. Yeah, that waste has a lot of, some people have concern about it. But it seems like and just the solution, if people aren't willing to deal with large scale renewables and they don't want to see them, then okay, build a nuke plant out in Palo Verde away from everyone and send the power to the city.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting you mentioned that about the solar, because I'm in agreement. The one of the great virtues of solar is that the solar resource can be closer to the consumer, right? So you don't necessarily need the as much high voltage transmission capacity, but you also have, it has power density 10 times that of wind. So, about 10 watts per square meter. But so we've covered Kauai, we've covered Hawaii kind of more generally then. So, and by the way, I need to make my identification. You're listening to the Power Hungry podcast. My guest is Brad Rockwell, the executive manager of the Kauai Island, executive manager of operations at the Kauai Island Utility Cooperative. You can learn more about them at kiuc.coop. That's kiuc.coop. So Brad, let's talk about these issues more broadly than in the U.S. You said you're very much all of the above strategy. Why is it then that the idea of 100% renewables has become so politically popular? Because that is the way I see it, that there's a very large and powerful group of people who are saying, well, this is the only way. It should all be wind and solar. Why do you think that idea is so politically popular?
Well, I think it's because it sounds good, and most people that are most people in this world don't have to operate grids, and so they don't have to deal and be responsible for the challenges of some of these decisions, right? And so I get to see it all, and clearly I'm an advocate for renewables, but there's a place for other options as well, and we have to. I think clearly, first and foremost, we have to make sure we deliver safe and reliable power at an affordable price. And when you start saying how, what you can do to do that and what you can't, it gets difficult, especially when you start looking at the fact that each area is different. Each area has different resources. Southeastern part of the country doesn't have a lot of wind resources. Other places have more solar resources. And what are you going to do in the northern part of that country? I mean, it's just a broad statement to say 100% is the way to go. And it's like, well, no, I think we need to continue to be cleaner and to continue to do things at large scale because it's more efficient than to work on other aspects of our energy issue like transportation and things like that. Building efficiency when you can and stuff. But bottom line, I think it sounds good, and most people aren't really too tuned in with the real challenges of running the grid.
And is that because, I mean, it's one of the things that seems to me is so unique about the electricity sector, right? That people understand oil better, I think, than any other form of energy because a lot of people pump their own gas. And so they have an idea of what it costs, how long it takes to fuel the car. They can smell it. They don't touch it generally, but it's more tactile to them. It has more resonance to them in terms of the physicalness of it. Whereas the grid, it's just like, well, I plug in and therefore why can't it all be renewable? And back to the renewable or the rural urban thing, it's just, oh, well, we'll put that stuff out there. In someone else's neighborhood,
yeah,
but don't put it in my neighborhood, right?
Sure.
And it sounds like all of these issues are ones that you're seeing even in the microcosm there in your own grid in terms of those challenges. How do you see it?
Yeah, no, that's true. And I think what I think of also is how, I think a lot of people, some people can afford to put solar on their roof. I mean, I have it on mine. I don't have a battery at my home, but I have solar. And a lot of people that can do that tend to be wealthier, more savvy about energy and things like that. And they just think, well, everyone can just put it on their roof, and then, we don't need power plants and things like that. We'll just all be so distributed, and there'll be this new energy economy. But if putting solar on your roof makes more sense on Kauai than just about anywhere else because of our high rates, and to this day, only 13% of our customers have solar on the roof. So.
And the co-op doesn't help. It doesn't subsidize that at all, or do you?
We don't provide a rebate. There's a pretty lucrative, there's still the federal tax incentive, and there's a pretty lucrative state tax incentive. So that's how it's subsidized. But most of those people, when they go to put solar on, they don't want to just reduce their midday demand. They want to actually overbuild the system to try and get to a zero bill each month, right? So they want to sell me a bunch of excess power during the midday when I told you I'm already 100% renewable. I don't need it. I can't really pay you for it. Even still, if I say I can't pay you for it, they still want to just give it to me. They want their system overbuilt. So these people now are not really contributing to the price, the cost of the grid. Now, all that burden shifted to the other 87% that don't have this, that maybe they're renters or their home, isn't suited for it, or they just don't have the money to put in a $10 or $20, $30, $40,000 system. And people will say, well, that's where community solar comes in, and we're doing some community solar projects. But still, this is the grid is an amazing thing, and it allows people who have renewables on their roof it's essentially a huge storage device that's going to be there when your system isn't producing. Even your battery, even if you have one or two power walls, you're still going to need the grid for some times. To size a battery at your home, you'd need, to basically tell the utility, take your line off my house. You would have to figure out the ultimate most power you're going to use. You're throwing a Super Bowl party and it's February and there's no sun. And, that's how you got to size your storage.
Right.
Right. Unless you don't want to be able to watch the fourth quarter of the game or something. So
right.
That's a huge battery. That's much more than one Powerwall.
I'm just having a little trouble on the audio here. Can you hear me now still?
Okay.
Yeah.
I hear you.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's jump back to that idea on the solar, because that's one of the things that I think is really important to keep in mind, is that the people who have solar, and I have solar panels on the roof of my house, and I got 3 different subsidies, right? I got the investment tax credit, the federal investment tax credit, the Austin Energy paid an amount of $6,000 or $7,000, and then Austin Energy was also giving me a very lucrative payments for the electricity I produce, which is about a 1 megawatt hour a month. So I was getting 3 different subsidies. But you mentioned that issue of the equity. Then can you follow that up again a little bit? So are the people, you said 13% have solar on their roof, are the 87% then effectively subsidizing the 13%? Tell me how that works.
Yeah. So, that 13% that have solar on the roofs, it's broken up, and there's a small amount that are NEM. Those people are clearly being subsidized by the rest of us, because
NEM, I'm sorry.
NEM is a straight net energy metering. Sorry,
okay.
It's a
right.
straight
okay.
retail for retail.
Right.
That's a relatively small amount. Most of our customers with their solar system, and then they're actually selling any excess to us at our avoided cost rate, which is unfortunately tied to the price of oil. So we're paying for excess solar based on the current month's cost of oil,
Okay.
which is something we're trying to get resolved, but we're a fully regulated utility, so things take time. And so those people that can afford to put these systems in are doing fine. They're paying relatively less than their fair share to continue to operate the grid and to be able to have this amazing resource they're still tied to for when a cloudy day comes or their battery doesn't have enough storage and whatnot. And the rest of us are paying. So it's just a very nuanced issue, but there's definitely a social justice aspect of installing rooftop solar.
Yeah, and I like the way you put that they are paying relatively less than their fair share, and that is something that we've seen in California. And the California Public Advocates Office has made this very point, that because people are putting on more rooftop solar, then the utilities are selling fewer watt hours. Well, so then their existing costs have to be spread over fewer watt hours, which means every watt hour just gets a little bit more expensive. So
right.
That's the dynamic we're talking about. Is that not right? Or
Yeah,
is that fair?
that's the dynamic. And I would also add that in here, I think it anywhere, but especially here, the cost that I can do a central station solar plant for compared to what I can put it on my house, and I know this because I just did it, central station is about 1/4 the cost of installing it on my house. So if you think about, well, if we're going to just do it with everyone's rooftop, the amount of capital that's involved is going to be 4 times more than doing it with central station.
Uh-huh.
But yet the numbers still work for these individual ratepayers. How does that? Because these subsidies and things like that. So ultimately, we're all paying through it for our taxes and things. We're subsidizing this very capital intensive method to allow people to have the option to do it and to cut back on their demand. I think there's a place for it. It's just, if I could sort of go back in time, I'd say, look, we've only got X number of rooftops on the island. My midday demand is Y. So, you can't overbuild these systems and sort of juice your economics, if you will.
Because, and I think that's a key point, and you've referred to it before, which is that, yeah, you can run 100% renewables for some hours, but then you always have to have the available generation capacity for when that renewable source isn't available. And that is goes back to the capital requirements, right? That you've got to, the issue for almost all of its history, the electric grid is operated on this idea, well, we're only going to build as much capacity as we need and no more. But now, correct me if I'm wrong, the challenge with renewables is that you have to overbuild the grid and then therefore invest more capital to have the system available for when the ready to kick in when the renewables aren't available. So it may be twice the size of what would in an optimal historical sense is what may need twice as much capacity as you would historically. Is that, am I overstating it?
I think it's fair. I don't know if it's twice as much. I mean, our view here has been, we're not going to retire any of our conventional capacity while we add renewables. So clearly, I mean, we could have met the demand without any of these renewables by just burning a lot of fuel in our conventional units. Now we're adding renewables. It cuts down on our fuel costs, but we still have to maintain this capacity because the days occur every now and then when there's no sun here, or the hydro is not performing, or the biomass plant's down, and people won't stand for days of no power. So we have to maintain that capacity. So yeah, there's going to be more resources. That's not necessarily a bad thing. I think it's good to have more capacity, but it is hopefully beneficial from an economic standpoint because the renewables you're adding are very cost competitive.
Right. And you don't have, and the other thing that is unique about your system is that it's relatively small. So, I mean, in terms of you have 1,400 miles of high voltage transmission, which, you're 500 square miles, 562 square miles. I mean, you're not having to build high voltage transmission to meet your needs for renewables. Is that true?
Yes. Yeah. Because our grid is, our island is almost a circle, and our grid is, our transmission system goes around the island already.
I see.
It's not like we have, some sort of back corner of the island where there's no part of the transmission system or the grid that we're going to develop renewables and we have to build a long interconnection. It's, essentially it's not too far to tap into the existing transmission or substations whenever we build a new renewable resource.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, Brad, this has been great. I mean, it's been, we had some challenges earlier on when we talked, but I'm glad that we could talk about these things. If I missed something that we need to discuss either regarding Hawaii and the limits there, or any other things that you want to discuss?
I think that, I know you always like to do a call to action, and for me as maybe just a utility guy, I'm not trying to sell anything, or I'm just trying to talk about the challenges and things. And I think, I think most people will agree that we want to do more renewables, and there'll be varying levels of, whether that's possible or whether it makes sense or not. But in order to do that, it's going to require a lot of support. We talked about it here today, that even large scale renewable projects are getting some resistance. And so people need to figure out what they can get behind, what they can support, instead of focusing on what they don't and protesting against things. If you've got an issue with something, get involved, open the dialogue, figure out what is it about that thing you don't like, and figure out how you can solve that issue and maybe get behind it. Because the fact is, it's a physics issue. Renewables are not very energy intensive, or not very energy dense. They're going to take up a lot of space. They're going to be in everyone's neighborhood, not just Kahuku on Oahu. They're going to be, not just in Puna on the Big Island. They're going to be all over the place. And so if we're going to really get to 100% renewables, we're going to have to figure out how to get comfortable with these things, because the days of generating power in the middle of the desert and sending the power to the large cities, or generating power in one corner of the island and sending it around, it seems like those days are gone, because people don't want those types of power plants anymore.
And that's about the sensitivity of people in their regions, about their neighborhoods, that people care about that. Is that I'm just responding to what you said. Is that I'm paraphrasing what
Sure.
you said. Is that fair?
Yeah, I mean, nobody wants to live near a power plant. I don't care what kind it is, and live near power lines. But we all want that power, and we all are using more and more of it. And electrification is only going to make that increase as transportation and other parts of our daily lives switch over to electricity. So these things are coming to a head.
Are you well? I'm glad you brought that up. So, are you seeing any electric vehicles on Kauai? And if you are, have you done any projections on what that might mean for your load?
Yeah, we are. It's a relatively slow rate. We've got a few, I think the last 2 months we had 7 new EV registrations each month. So we've got a few hundred here on the island. That's compared to 70,000 registered vehicles total. So it's still a very small amount. And we have done some analysis. Luckily, this huge amount of storage we've added with these PV farms suit us quite well for meeting any sort of increased peak, right? I can handle a peak that's way more than what we're dealing with just because of the storage, and I can do it for hours.
Right.
So that, solar and storage couples very well with the coming electrification.
Gotcha. Electrification of transportation. Right.
Sure.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Well, I think that's a good spot to end. My guest is Brad Rockwell, the executive manager of operations at the Kauai Island Utility Cooperative. Brad, I'm really pleased we were able to do this, and I appreciate your patience on finally getting it right. We had a few stumbles in making it happen. And thanks to all of you for listening to the Power Hungry podcast. If you like it, give us a positive rating on your favorite platform, iTunes or Apple Podcasts or Spotify or wherever you're listening. And be sure and tune in again. So Brad Rockwell, many thanks again for being with us. And to all of you out there, we'll talk to you again on the next, or see you again, I hope, on the next podcast edition of the Power Hungry podcast.